My name is Nick Brand. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our panel to our platform. As you can see, it's one of the larger panels in Council recent memory, and we're really delighted to have such a distinguished group with us tonight. We are on the record this evening, so that means that while you are welcome to use social media, please do silence your phones. We're also live streaming. So the video from this evening will be available on our website basically immediately after, and tomorrow if you'd like to share it with anyone. After the program, Luis Martínez-Fernández's recent book, Revolutionary Cuba, A History, will be available for purchase and signing just over there. We have a number of exciting upcoming programs at the Council. Tomorrow evening, March 31st, the editor of Politico, Susan Glasser, will be here to discuss foreign policy and the 2016 election. On April 1st, Berkeley economist Barry Eichengreen will kick off our Global Economy series, and he'll be talking about the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and the uses and misuses of history. On April 9th, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, will be continuing our series, the Global Economy series, and he'll be discussing his lessons from the financial crisis. So I will return to moderate the audience Q&A portion of this evening. However, chairing our panel this evening is Bill Mahoney. Bill is a founding partner at Segal, McCambridge, Singer, and Mahoney, and has served as the firm's co-chairman for the past 7 years. In addition to his leadership role at the firm, Bill is active personally and professionally in the community. Among his many activities, he was recently appointed to the Chairman's Circle Board of the National Democratic Institute in Washington. He's also vice chairman of the Chicago Committee on, the Chicago Committee of Human Rights Watch, and he's also a longtime friend and supporter of the council. So please join me in welcoming Bill Mahoney and our distinguished panel.
Right. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. Actually, the reason I'm moderating this panel is I'm married to a smart, beautiful woman who was born in Havana and chose to marry and live with me here. So that's basically my singular qualification to do this Cuban panel. I'm delighted. I'm basically going to introduce tonight's speakers and give you a sense of where we would like to go with this forum. In December 2014, President Obama announced that the United States was moving to normalize relations with Cuba. Historically, diplomatic relations with Cuba had ended back January 3rd, 1961, when Eisenhower was president. A full trade and economic embargo was imposed on Cuba by the United States in 1962, and that embargo was strengthened and tightened by actions in 1992 and I believe 1996. Also, with the aura of Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union, Cuba became part of the Cold War dispute between the United States and the Soviets. So I think it's fair to say that for over 50 years, the relationship between Cuba and the United States has been anything but normal. It essentially has been hostile. In the short term, I think we're going to hear that the restoration of diplomatic ties has involved prisoner exchanges, loosening of some travel restrictions, and a relaxation of some of the economic sanctions. However, the long-term implications of this Cuba-U.S. thaw really remain to be seen. There's lots of open questions, and that's what we have our panel here to enlighten you on this evening. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to wave at you when I introduce them, because they're not sitting in the order I have their names here. First of all, we have Frank Calzón. Frank is the executive director of the Center for a Free Cuba, a long-time involvement with issues involving Cuba, and I think fair to say that Mr. Calzón is not a proponent of the change in the policy, and he'll articulate why. To my left is Alberto Coll. Alberto is currently professor of law and director of European and Latin American legal studies at DePaul here in Chicago. He served in the George H.W. Bush administration as Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense, and his longtime expertise in these Cuban matters. Luis Martínez-Fernández is our historian. He's a professor of History and Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. And for those of you who don't know or follow these things, the Brookings Institute is basically the granddaddy of public policy think tanks in D.C. So we're lucky to have Ted with us. And to my right is Julissa Reynoso. She is a partner at a law firm in New York, Chadbourne and Parke. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central America, the Caribbean, and Cuban Affairs in the U.S. Department of State, I believe from 2009 to 2011. So we have a distinguished panel. They've all agreed to abide by the Global Affairs House rules, sort of our principles, which is, particularly with a big panel, some sense of equity in how the time is shared, and also a great sense of civility. So in short terms, that basically means no filibusters, no violence. And we'll go from there, okay? So we'll start off, I'm going to ask Alberto to frame the issue a little bit. Basically explain for the audience what happened in December of 2014. What is normalization and reestablishing relations? What is the president attempting to accomplish? Do you support the move? And what do you foresee as the near-term and mid-term steps to execute the new policy? And what are some of the pitfalls it may confront?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you to the council. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here with all my fellow panelists. And to cut to the heart of your question, why did the president do this? Several issues, but the first one is that the United States had become dramatically isolated in its Cuba policy, isolated from the international community and isolated from Latin America. Ironically enough, our Cuba policy, which was intended to isolate Cuba, had wound up isolating the United States. There was no more dramatic example of this than the General Assembly resolutions that have been passed every year since 1992 criticizing the U.S. embargo. And the last 10 years were particularly embarrassing because all of our closest allies, I'm not talking about adversaries of the United States, I'm talking about our European allies, I'm talking about Japan, I'm talking about center-right governments in Latin America. They were all critical of us, and we only had one vote in favor of the embargo along with that of the United States, and that was Israel. But the funny thing about the Israeli vote is that even though Israel voted in favor of the U.S. embargo, they don't have a U.S. embargo, they don't have an embargo on Cuba, and they actually allow Israeli companies to trade with Cuba and Israeli investors to invest in Cuba. So this was a very problematical issue. And then finally in Latin America, the Cuba policy of the United States had become the equivalent to what 20, 30 years ago had been the Panama Canal. A very iconic but nevertheless powerful symbol of an American policy that was rejected universally across Latin America. And again, I'm talking about friends of the United States. These are pro-free market, conservative governments like those of Mexico, Colombia under President Uribe, now President Santos, the government of Peru, the government of Chile under Sebastián Piñera, as well as the government of Michelle Bachelet. And they were all saying to the United States, you have to change your Cuba policy because it's a key obstacle to an overall improvement in U.S. ties with Latin America. But something else had been happening too, which I think the president perceived, which is that the world had been changing and that Latin America had been changing, and the United States could no longer take for granted the fact that it at one point had a dominant position in the region. And so what were we looking at? We were looking, for example, at a massive investment by Brazil in Cuba, close to $1 billion in the port of Mariel by the Grupo Odebrecht. We were looking at increasing Chinese commerce with Cuba. We were looking at Russia making moves in the direction of restarting a partnership with Cuba along economic as well as political lines. And the United States decided that it could not be left out of this, and that if we did not want to cede, for example, oil exploration opportunities to the Chinese oil company, or investment opportunities in the island to Brazilian companies, or political and geopolitical ground to Russia, we had to become involved. The second dimension of this, of course, is a moral dimension. Many people say, well, we should not have done this because Cuba has a poor human rights record. But the problem with that is that we are 5% of the world. Okay? And we don't realize that to us, the rest of the world, this policy looks very hypocritical because, as a matter of fact, we have very active political and economic relationships with other governments around the world whose human rights records are really no better than Cuba's. I'm talking about China, I'm talking about Vietnam, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about Algeria, okay? So yes, we do care about human rights. This is a proper concern. But perhaps since the embargo and isolation had failed to make any dent on Cuba's human rights policies, one way to try to have some influence, limited though it might be, and I will be the first to say that our influence on human rights issues in Cuba will be very limited under this policy, would be through engagement. And then there was finally the moral weight. You know, there was the fact that Pope Francis threw his weight. I'm not talking now just about the international community, about General Assembly resolution. I'm talking about Pope Francis throwing his weight behind the initiative. The fact that all the Cuban churches were in favor of this initiative. The fact that the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops very strongly has come out against the embargo and in favor of a policy of engagement. And then finally, there was a question of how people in Cuba might feel about this. And even though some members of the dissident community recently came to Washington, they testified against the policy, many other members have supported a policy of engagement. Just 3 years ago, a large number of dissidents, for example, including Ioannis Sanchez, wrote a letter stating that the United States should allow American citizens to travel to Cuba, that this would be good for the island. And then finally, of course, we have this huge growing entrepreneurial class in Cuba, over 450,000 people in Cuba who today do not depend on the state for their livelihood. It's still a small sector, but it's a growing sector. They all have been very supportive of the policy because they see it as an improvement. So let me make it very clear. I don't think President Obama is utopian about this. I don't think any of us on this panel is utopian. Cuba is not going to change overnight as a result of this policy. But we have had a failed policy of isolation for 54 years. I predict that with this change in policy, we will have greater leverage over whatever happens in Cuba. And let's face it, things are going to be happening just as a result of biological forces. The Castro brothers will die. A new generation will come into power. And that the United States, if we gather together here 5 or 7 years from now, we probably will be able to agree that the policy, with all its limitations and with all the obstacles that are still in the way of this relationship, will have been a net gain, not just for Cuba, but also for the interests of the United States.
Thanks. I think there's a growing skepticism as to whether the Castro brothers actually will ever die, but okay.
As Bill Buckley once famously said, I do think that eventually Fidel Castro will die.
I'd like to, again, there's a long history behind this, and we're lucky to have Professor Martínez-Fernández here with us. Professor, if you could, I'd like you to put for the audience basically Cuba in context, particularly the Cuba-American relation, because it goes back before Castro in 1959. It's a tangled history. Why don't you educate everybody?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and thanks for the audience. I'm a college professor. I spent a couple of decades doing research on the 19th century, which is a very safe time to write about. Nobody complained, nobody raised a hand. I was there, and that's not the way it was.
Right.
But then I felt a sense of responsibility to write about the Cuban Revolution for many reasons, one of them being explaining what am I doing in the country in which I was not supposed to be, why I'm not in Cuba, why I'm not teaching at the University of Havana. And also, to be very honest with you, I read so many outrageous things about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution from the right, from the left, and I thought that it was important to venture into this very difficult to navigate world of the Cubanologists who work on recent Cuba. But I believe that my experience studying the 19th century, and even before that, really gives me a historical perspective that I think should be understood. These are two countries that are neighbors. Nobody can change that. Sometimes I use the metaphor of a married couple. They split, but they're still forced to live in the same house. So that will not change. And these relations have been very complicated. U.S. presence began in the mid-1900s, in the mid-1800s, a lot of it had to do with investments in sugar. That has been a very special bond between these two countries. Cuba remains, if not physically and economically, I think Cuba remains enslaved, although Castro said back in 2002, sugar belongs to the time of slavery, we should get out of it. But still, there are a lot of the ideas about society, hierarchy. These are legacies of an economy that was based on sugar production. Then we also need to understand, and one of the reasons why I think I have a different perspective on what's happening and what may happen in the near future in terms of U.S.-Cuba relations is because I studied 1898. And I see many patterns and many situations that led to the problems that eventually led to 1959. And I think that it's interesting that, Cuba and Mexico, which are the nearest neighbors, well, Canada is of course a neighbor as well, are the two most nationalistic countries in Latin America. And there's good reasons for that. So 1898 comes. I teach Cuban history, and every now and then one of my students talks about the Spanish-American War. And with respect, and using it as an education moment, and why do you call the war Spanish-American War? Well, because it was the U.S. against Spain. Well, look into it. Cubans have been fighting for 3 years. It was a horrendous war. Few people realized that there were concentration camps in Havana, built by the Spaniards. 200,000 Cubans died in those concentration camps. So we're a proud people. We're a people that, for good or for worse, venerate men on horseback. It's part of our trajectory. If you walk down or ride by one of those boulevards in Havana, you will see this lineup of heroes, men on horseback. And of course, Jose Martí, who ironically died on horseback as well on his first day of battle because of his pride. Maceo, who was the black general, who I really see as one of my greatest heroes, was sort of indicating, well, Martí, it's very easy to be an agitator in New York and Tampa. Why don't you come here? So he went there and he died. So that's very important. And the link with the United States is that when the war ended, the United States and representatives from Spain sat at a negotiating table. And the Cubans were not allowed there. So you begin to see that there's paradoxical elements to this relationship. Because on the one hand, and there's a great book by a colleague and friend, Unbecoming Cuban, by Lou Perez. I really recommend that book. He emphasizes the similarities between these two countries. And I would agree with him. If you look at patterns of consumption, for example, popular culture in some regards, the fascination with baseball, fascination with Hollywood, the fact that so many Cubans came to the United States to study, those are important. But my criticism of it is that if we look at the underlying cultural assumptions, we're talking about two very different countries. And I see that somewhere as an inheritance from the tensions, cultural and otherwise, between Spain and Great Britain in Europe. So what happens? Cubans win the war, we are humiliated, we are told you cannot be independent unless you agree to this amendment, which is the Platt Amendment, which was very humiliating. It meant that the United States had the right to control Cuban treaties with other nations, particularly when it pertained to loans, for example. The U.S. could intervene. So those are some of the elements in the background that we need to understand. I don't want to take more time than I want to, but then we look at the Cuban Revolution. And it's interesting to see that the changing position of the United States. Batista became an odious dictator. He was in power. He was okay until things were sort of in control. And I think this is one important point, because the Castro brothers gave the United States what the United States always wanted. And that was a stable government without social violence. And when you contrast 1959 with the past, you can see that. So that's that gives me pause as to perhaps being one of the reasons why the Castros have lasted so long. Lastly, I want to make just a couple of comments about attempts in the past to improve relations. And it's been interesting because the United States moves towards improvement, then Cuba moves in the other direction. They've never been as coordinated as they are today. And the last thing is that I don't want Cuba to be back in 1898, to be honest. And although I'm in favor of the negotiations, how can I be against two governments talking? I'm a little bit concerned that we may go to what happened in the early 20th century, and that is to have a Cuban economy of enclaves dominated by foreign capital, and a Cuban economy of kiosks for the Cuban people. So my concern is precisely that, going back more than a century before.
And in that context, and you're saying there's some risk involved from the Cuban perspective as well, that things could revert to the way they were over 100 years ago. This was not a unilateral act by the United States. At the same time President Obama was making his speech, Raul Castro was speaking in Cuba saying they wanted to go forward as well. What do you think is motivating the Cuban government today to embark on these negotiations? What do they hope to achieve?
Well, they've been seeing the writing on the wall in terms of Venezuela's unsustainability of the Chavista government. It's always been a matter of Cuba really being, I don't believe in luck as a historian, but to be able to take advantage of the geopolitical situations. First, the Soviet Union and China. Some preferred China, others the Soviet Union. Then Castro brilliantly triangulated those two countries. And then we see that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the proximity in terms of relations with Venezuela and other countries like Iran, for example, and even Korea. So I would say that the geopolitics have always been there. Now, pertaining to the United States, I'm still grappling with understanding what has transpired. We historically think that lifting the embargo has been an objective of the left in this country, and that it has been the right that has been in opposition. Ever since the first President Bush, there has been an unholy alliance, if you will, of the most progressive elements and big business wanting to have the same accomplishments. So I think there's something about that today.
Ted, in this, one of the things that I think is a little difficult to comprehend is they talk about normalization of relations, but even if we reestablish diplomatic ties, as they're normally understood, it's still not going to be a normal relationship because we still have an economic embargo in place, and that can't be removed by presidential authority. Only the Congress can do that. So what is your perspective on how these tracks are going to be coordinated? What can happen in terms of economic changes in Cuba as long as the embargo is still in place? And long term, what are the prospects, if the embargo is removed, for economic dialogue and cooperation between the United States and Cuba?
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming. And I should say at the outset that the Brookings Institution is a think tank that's independent, and we don't have an institutional position on anything. It's all individual scholars who speak and research, so I just want to make that clear. So I'm speaking on my own behalf. I would say in terms of the potential here for normalization. It's a funny word when you think about U.S.-Cuba relations. I don't think we'll ever get to a normal state. It has not been a normal relationship for decades. But I think there is an important distinction between establishing diplomatic relations and normalization, if you want to call it that, the fuller range of relationships that can happen. Diplomatic relations is a simpler step that involves recognizing each other's as nation states with embassies in each country that allow diplomats to travel throughout the country, have, in that sense, normal diplomatic engagement and talks. And that is long overdue in my view, and that's what's being negotiated as we speak. It's been a couple months formally. Of course, we had 18 months of secret talks before the announcement on December 17th, and we should really take a moment and acknowledge what a big deal that was. There's a very good book called Back Channel to Cuba, which documents the 50 years of secret talks that had happened, Republicans, Democrats, and failed. And this one didn't fail. It came through. And I think partly it was because it was kept so secret. And the Canadians and the Vatican, there are various actors behind the scenes who are playing a role. But the drama of December 17th, the impact it had in both countries, and the momentum it created by having two presidents at the top saying, we are going to start talking and figuring out this problem, I think allowed the big breakthrough in mentality, in attitude, in kind of seeing each other as not partners, we're not going to be friends overnight, but maybe less as hostile enemies, but as two countries that can at least talk to each other and figure out ways to pragmatically cooperate with each other in each other's interests. So in this first step, it's not only the diplomatic negotiation relationship, which, by the way, involves a very sticky issue for the Cubans. We want full access to all of Cuban society. So we want to be able to travel around the island and to welcome people into the embassy as we currently do, including providing support to individuals that are opposed to the Cuban government. And of course, the Cubans say that's interference in our internal affairs, that's a violation of the Vienna Convention, you can't do that. And I think they're going to have a hard time actually working out what the rules of the game will be on that issue. So it might take a little longer than initial hopes were that somehow this would get done before the Summit of the Americas in Panama, which is happening in just 2 weeks. But I think it will happen. I think if you read the different statements of both diplomats, they're saying, we're going to keep talking, we're going to figure this out, we know there are going to be lots of mixed signals and interruptions, we're going to keep working this through. And that's the advantage of presidential leadership, presidential diplomacy, kicking this off in a big, bold way with a big coalition, particularly in the United States, that's diverse, it's business groups, it's human rights groups, it's religious groups, academics. It's Republicans as well as Democrats, it's Cuban Americans as well as all the rest of us who are not Cuban Americans but have a stake in having some kind of relationship with this neighbor of ours and being able to travel there without Washington saying, no, you can't travel there. It's the only country in the world that we have this problem with. So it was this page-turning moment that really said, okay, we're going to leave the Cold War behind. President Obama made it very clear back in 2008 when he was campaigning in Florida and said, I'm going to try something new with Cuba, and we're going to start by allowing more Cuban Americans to travel there. We're going to allow Cuban Americans to send more money to their families, and we're going to see where that goes. And that played itself out in a fairly positive way until Alan Gross was arrested, who was doing democracy programming work for USAID. And of course, the Cubans see that as a direct attack, as his regime change, these are mercenaries, and threw him in jail for 5 years. And that really slowed things down. I'm sure Julissa can go into great detail about that. So we had to solve that problem in order to get to this next stage. And with President Obama getting through the midterm elections, thinking about legacy, deciding I'm going to use my executive authority, and by the way, I think there's no question that he was well within his powers under executive authority to do the things he did, to go bold and to bite off as much as he could to say we're going to try this new approach. Now, where does it go from here? I think we're going to see a 2-year window of opportunity while Obama is still in the White House and Raul Castro is still in power, of pragmatic efforts to find ways we can cooperate. And I think that'll be across different domains. It'll cover aviation. It'll cover counter-narcotics cooperation, which is already underway. We have maritime security issues, environmental management, making sure that if there's an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, we've got cooperation on managing that. There'll be a number of areas like that. I think the hardest issue will be the human rights problems. And we see human rights very differently. Cubans are very proud of their idea of human rights, which is economic and social rights. And in fact, they have some achievements to be proud of in education and healthcare, et cetera. We focus on political and civil rights, and Cuba has a bad record on those issues. And there's a long historical tension and ideological battle over this. The Cubans will stand their ground, and I think try to maintain as much political control as possible. Where the opportunity exists is on the economics front and empowering the Cuban people. This is why President Obama spoke so specifically about empowering the Cuban people to become more independent of the Cuban state. And the Cuban regime has now opened the door for that to happen. As Alberto mentioned, 450,000 businesses that have opened up, restaurants, hotels, barbershops, small businesses. But they're slowly starting to grow. They're getting a lot of support from their families in the United States. And this is the beginning of a private sector in Cuba. There are also cooperatives that are beginning to operate. And these new steps the president has allowed, a whole set of new regulations that allow Americans to work directly with those individuals. So going around the Cuban state and saying, we're going to work directly with these people in humanitarian ways and in other ways, and hope for that sector to grow. It's a bet. We don't know where it's going to go. It's going to be slow. The Cubans are going to try to control it as much as possible. But economically, they need this as much as we want it. And that's where I think there's hope.
Okay. Marcelino, we talked a little bit of your bio. You were in the Bay of Pigs, political prisoner in Cuba. My law school roommate's father actually served in the Bay of Pigs. And what they taught me was the people who served, that was the definition of a Cuban patriot. So as a Cuban patriot and someone who, as I gather, has been opposed to the Castro regime going back a long way, could you give us your perspective today on whether this initiative is appropriate and why?
Thank you for the audience, for the interest in the problems of my country. Thank you to Bill. Thank you to my fellow panelists. I am going to speak from the perspective of a Cuban in the active opposition, in the political opposition in Miami, with very strong ties with the opposition in Cuba. So we want to see the opposition as one, not the opposition there and here, but there is one Cuban opposition that, by the way, the Cuban government denies the fact that there is an existing opposition. I learned many lessons after the Bay of Pigs when I was a prisoner of war, but one of the lessons I learned applicable to the meeting today is that I learned there that the Cuban problem cannot be solved with the direct help or involvement of any other nation. Like the professor said, that doesn't happen to Cuba what happened in 1898, that we fought for 30 years and at the end we lost. We were not in the negotiating table. So I learned that, and since then I have always looked and worked my political work in the Christian Democratic Party and in a coalition that we are creating right now in Miami called Consenso Cubano. I have always looked at the Helms-Burton Law and the confrontation between the United States government and the Cuban government as a wrong definition of the problem. And I think this opening, this new situation, as a completely new definition of the Cuban issue. And finally, we Cubans, in Cuba and outside, have to realize that we are the only ones who are going to solve the problem. And in that sense, the relationship between both governments redefines, as I said before, the situation, and now we realize that it's only us. The Cuban opposition in Cuba, and many of us outside, in December 17 was a day of joy. More than 80% of the Cuban people is in favor because, among other things, they are in such a critical economic, social, all type of conditions, so critical that this opening means a rate of hope. The key word is hope. The Cuban people for many years, they have lost hope. They feel impotent in front of a government that is very strict and knows how to control the population. So the fact that there is hope, I think, is one of the reasons why I, as an opposition, active member of the opposition, believe that this is good. In addition to that, one of the reasons why the Cuban people are so happy in Cuba, the common person, is because they believe that this new opening is going to improve their precarious economic situation. And indeed, one of the executive orders of President Obama is to increase the remittances from $600 to $2,000. Remittances is one of the larger incomes that the Cuban people have from abroad. About $5 billion actually per year is as much as Cuban tourism is one of the major things. Other than Venezuelan oil has been first to the Cuban remittances, and now the Venezuelan oil has been cut in 50%. Therefore, for the people of Cuba in that precarious situation, the increase in remittances is an immediate economic improvement for those who receive remittances. Those who doesn't receive remittances, they hope that their economic situation with more tourists, with more business, everything is going to improve. They have that hope. And hope is a very important factor in our human development. Finally, one of the important key variables that I believe is going to help the Cuban people and is going to help us as oppositors to do our job as opposition is the increase in information. There is already a movement inside Cuba and outside Cuba to provide more internet, to provide more telephones. There are right now, I believe, about 1.5 million telephones in Cuba, more communications. They are very creative, the Cubans there, and they create intranets, so they have more information. And then the hope, the economics, in the information, these three factors will help the opposition, and that's why the opposition movement, more than 60–70% of the leaders of the opposition there are in favor of this move, as well as outside. So that's why we support. I can talk also as an American, because I am American, and I am an academic, graduated from Northwestern University. From that perspective, I don't want to add more than to what you add. I join that. I believe that for the image, like Mr. Coll said, for the image of the United States, this is essential. A big country like the United States is doing the ridiculous every year in the United Nations, in front of the Latin American countries. Is bad news for the United States. I think it's the right move for the most powerful country in the world cannot give the image of be fighting with a very small government that is nowhere. So that's the reason why I am all in favor, and I applaud this situation.
Thanks. Julissa, you had regional responsibilities in the State Department. What's the impact regionally? South America, Caribbean, Latin America? How is this playing, and where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I had the I was in charge of the Cuba portfolio from 2009 to 2011, where we started rolling out the changes. We started actually negotiating with the Cuban government in 2010, not 18 months. We started negotiating with the Cuban government in Haiti after the earthquake, and that's where a lot of these ideas originally came to pass, and were discussed in a very high level way with the foreign minister of Cuba. And one of our main sticking points at that point was the detention of Alan Gross, but there were other things that were discussed as well that evolved over the time and the period. But Alan Gross was the significant impediment to any furtherance of the relationship. That said, we had the region, Latin America, the Caribbean, very much on top of us, urging us to resolve the problem, not only politically, but culturally and socially. The average Latin American and Caribbean citizen was very much exhausted with the United States position with respect to Cuba. And frankly, several governments used the position as a means of escaping their own responsibilities. So when we were pushing a certain government to do certain things that we thought were important with respect to their political human rights posture, they would respond and say, well, look what you're doing with Cuba. So it weakened our position bilaterally with certain countries, and also weakened our position regionally with respect to how the United States was seen in Latin America at large. I think the move with respect to dialogue and normalization is a very positive thing. My last position was, I was the U.S. ambassador in Uruguay until mid-December. And Uruguay has a leftist government, Tupamaro government, very much pro-Cuba, or pro-Castro government. But at the same time, we were able to manage the relationship in a way that they were also very pragmatic, and we worked well with the United States. The image and the gesture of moving forward with the United States, with Cuba, the United States, was very important in terms of that relationship. It was something that came up often. I can't tell you the countless times that we had bilateral meetings with any country, name a country in Latin America, with the president or with the secretary at that time. When I was there was Secretary Clinton and then Secretary Kerry, were amongst the 10 talking points that a foreign government would raise, there was always a point about Cuba. And that's something I think now we have such goodwill, even though it's a broad gesture, there's a lot of work to be done that will gain us access and possibilities with Latin America and the Caribbean that we did not have before. That said, I think we have to manage expectations. One of the things that I think has come from this announcement is this idea that everything is normal. Everything is not normal. There are lots of things that need to happen between now and who knows when for the relationship to be a relationship of trust and of transparency. There's also a great deal of changes that need to happen in Cuba for the United States to feel comfortable that we can have a broad agenda with the Cuban government. So I think there is a kind of euphoria at this point, which is important, but I also think if we don't manage that level of joy and hope, we may fail long term. So we have to be mindful of the steps we take going forward to ensure that this process does not generate significant important failures. One other thing that we have to keep in mind as we look at the region is the fact that with respect to Cuba, Cuba is surrounded by a lot of neighbors that have significant problems in terms of security. And so what is normal for Cuba? Hopefully, when we engage with the Cuban government and the Cuban state and Cuban society, we will assist them with the United States and getting them to a place where they don't have the failures that a lot of other Latin American countries have. Mexico, Jamaica, Dominican Republic. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic. If the objective is to get Cuba to be the Dominican Republic, then we have serious problems. So I think we have to manage what does not mean in terms of moving forward with a country that is beginning to really understand its new existence vis-a-vis the United States. But at the same time, we have to be thoughtful about not breaking the country in a rush to normalize in whatever way we think that may be conceived from our point of view. But definitely, bottom line, it has been a very positive gesture for the region. I think you're going to see steps coming down the pipe from discussions at the Summit of the Americas, potentially a more significant vote at the Organization of American States, and in my view, even more importantly, a possibility of facilitating financing to Cuba via the Inter-American Development Bank, which is going to be an important gesture in helping Cuba move from its very dire economic situation in terms of projects and the like. But again, it's something that we have to, if I were in Cuba, I would be very keen to be managing suspiciously, going back to the presentation by the professor about the history of foreigners coming in and kind of putting things in the pipe and managing things and recklessly kind of imposing ideas and policies and normalcy without proper consideration. Thank you.
Thanks. Frank, you've displayed a quality I don't normally associate with Cubans. You've been very patient. So we're getting a sense, obviously, a number of the panelists, I think with being realistic, but generally support the initiative. As I led off in your introduction, I think you continue to support the embargo and are not enthusiastic about this diplomatic move. So why don't you tell us why you are opposed to the direction the administration's taking, and what would you prefer the strategy to be? And specifically address, I think, a real key issue that people want to know about is even stipulating that the Cuban regime is not an admirable regime, and the Cuban regime's record on civil liberties and political rights is awful. Is that reason enough not to pursue diplomatic relations, considering the fact, as some of the other panelists have noted, we have records with we have diplomatic relations with lots of lousy regimes, including some of our allies.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad that you recognize that your appraisal of Cubans are not what you had in mind. Let me say that if I only knew what I have heard here tonight, I would also be waving the flag and supporting President Obama's actions. But there are a number of things that need to be brought into the discussion, and that are not necessarily simply the human rights question that you mentioned. First of all, I thought that American people were very enthusiastic about the idea of having a president in the White House that would base his public policy actions on transparency. That's not really what we got on this case, or in many other cases. There's no time to talk about them here. I'm glad that somebody mentioned Israel, for example, because I just met with the Israeli ambassador in Washington about 2 weeks ago, and he reminded me that now that the United States has normal relations with Cuba or with the Castro government, that it might be a good time for Cuba to reestablish normal diplomatic relations with Israel. Because Fidel Castro broke relations with Israel many years ago, basically because he wanted to be nice to the Arabs, radicals. Mr. Castro sent troops to the Golan Heights, and Mr. Castro, or the Castro brothers, continue to play a significant role at the United Nations in their strong hostility to Israel. I think for many Americans, the word Israel is important in this discussion. We heard about Cubans Well, my friends, Cuba is not the Cuban government. Cuba are 11 million souls. I do not agree that the Cubans are proud of their health system. The health system is a disaster. I don't believe that the Cuban people are proud of the educational system, where children are taught to read by looking at books that says guerrillero, guerrilla, F for Fidel, where Cubans go to prison for reading Animal Farm. Come on, this is not simply. And as far as looking at Saudi Arabia and the others, I come across that all the time. I guess I'm Cuban. I would like the model for Cuba to be Uruguay or to be Spain, but not to be North Korea nor Saudi Arabia. Let me look a little bit about the facts that were left out. One word, North Korea. I think the foreign policy of a nation has to do with defeating its enemies and supporting its friends and supporting the national interests of the United States. Less than 2 years ago, no one here mentions that. Less than 2 years ago, the Cuban government was caught trying to smuggle warplanes. This is a fact. I'm not talking about philosophy. I'm not talking what I think is going to happen 10 years from now. During the Obama administration, when the president means well, he extended a hand of friendship. Cuba was trying to smuggle warplanes to North Korea and missiles. What is that all about? This is 2 years ago, when Roberta Jacobson, who is a great human being, went to Cuba about a month ago to negotiate the discussion. She's the Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs. A Russian spy ship had arrived the day before and left the day after. Those are facts. But people discussing Cuba and Obama, I guess, don't want to talk about those things. When Roberta went to Havana a few days ago, who was there? The North Korean foreign minister. The North Korean foreign minister was saying that North Korea and Cuba are in the same trench against the United States. Now, have you ever heard about that? Does that mean something? The president says that he wants to empower the people of Cuba. The president says that he wants a new policy. And what is the new policy? The new policy is doing something different than what the United States has done until now, which is to put pressure on Cuba and put restrictions on Cuba. The new policy, frankly, is the old, failed policy that the rest of the world has had in regard to Cuba. The rest of the world has had full diplomatic relations with Cuba for 50-some years. Did that bring any change to Cuba? Did that help the economy in Cuba? Did that help human rights in Cuba? I think we all have to agree that the answer is no. The rest of the world has had millions of tourists to Cuba. Did that bring any change into Cuba? Does anybody tell you here, where do the tourist dollars go? If you think the tourist dollars go to build schools in Cuba, you're wrong. Because the tourist industry in Cuba, the hotels in Cuba are all controlled by the Cuban military. The dollars that tourists take to Cuba, and if I'm wrong, I hope that somebody will correct me in the panel. If the dollars that go through the tourists to Cuba, to the hotels, go to the military and the security service. The president, somebody wanted to know, what does the Cuban want? Well, the answer was very simple. The Cuban wants dollars. The Cuban government knows that it's in a very difficult situation. The Cuban government knows that in the last 50 years, Cuba has received more economic assistance from the outside world that some countries receive through the Marshall Plan during World War II. Those are facts. I guess we don't want to talk about those facts. Would it make sense for the president to say to Raul Castro, look, we want to have better relations? What about removing your Cuban police and Secret Service people out of Venezuela that are there training the government of Venezuela to abuse the Venezuelan people? What is the United States getting out of this other than for the president to feel that the old romantic idea of dealing with Cuba is finally coming to fruition? What is the president going to... Raul Castro now wants Cuba out of the terrorist list. And I'm sure some folks are going to tell you, well, happened many years ago. When you get home, go into your internet, go into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you'll see that there's a woman there among the 10 most wanted, and that the FBI is offering $2 million for information to get her. Where is she at? She's in Cuba. What did she do? She killed a New Jersey trooper, and then she was sentenced to life in prison, and then she escaped to Cuba. Those are facts, but we rather want to talk about hope. Hope, my friends, is not a policy. Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. The present administration says trust and hope. That is not going to help the Cuban people. Empowering the Cuban military is not going to help the Cuban people. Now, there's something that the administration could do. Now with the Europeans and the others, maybe the administration should talk to the Europeans and say, why don't we all get together and try to figure out what to do about Cuba? Now, the American policy is like the European policy. Now, what it lacks is a linkage. What it lacks is for the administration to say to Havana, look, you want American tourists? We can talk about that. We want the Cuban troops out of Venezuela. Can we talk about that? Now, Raul Castro says, no, that's a matter of principle. Raul Castro also wants to establish a spy Russian station in Cuba. Shouldn't that be part of the discussion? Raul Castro said that's a matter of principle. Raul Castro is currently orchestrating a campaign throughout Latin America because the president, count them, put 6 Venezuelans on a list of folks who would not be giving a visa to come to the United States. And that's a great example of American imperialism. And when the president goes to Panama, that's going to be the big issue. Now, remittances. We all like to help our families in Cuba. Do you know that the 80%, we talk about figures, and any figures that I use or anybody else in this panel use, go on the internet and check them out and see if those figures are accurate. About 80% of the Cuban people are not white. Do they receive remittances? Very few. The remittances go to the Cuban whites. Now, if you look at the Cuban government, you have to come to the conclusion that it's a racist government. Very few blacks in the leadership. Now, the remittances go to the white, and then there's something very interesting. The prices that Cubans have to pay are going up. And Cubans, everyday Cubans, get between $20 and $30 a month. That's what they get paid. This is why some American companies want to go to Cuba. Forget about the maquilladoras in Mexico. The folks that want to invest in Cuba want to go invest in Cuba, not because they want to help the Cuban people, because they can pay the workers $30 a month. And the workers don't have a right to strike, and they have labor unions, and the president and the workers and the think tanks, nobody's saying, wait a second. We're all in favor of doing that, but what about allowing the Cubans the ability to have a labor union? I'm sorry to have to rain in your parade, but I think Senator Moynihan, whom I knew personally, used to say that all of us are entitled to our own opinions, and that's true. But he used to say also, but we're not entitled to our own facts. I think the facts are significant. The facts need to be brought out into the open. The president finally has a real problem with the issue of terrorism because there are 3 Cubans that are under a federal grand jury. Again, you know, I'm full of facts. Under a federal grand jury in Florida, because they killed 4 men in international airspace, 3 of them Americans, and 1 a resident of the United States. 2 were pilots that pulled the trigger. 1 is the head of the Cuban Air Force. They're under indictment. I don't believe that the president has the ability, despite his ways of looking as flexible as possible to the Constitution, to say to the Justice Department, don't worry about the indictment. We got to move forward. The president exchanged a spy, and I'll finish with that. Exchanged a spy that was serving a life sentence in American prisons, because that spy was involved in the planning of the killing of Americans in the Florida Straits. And that was done without transparency and without talking to the relatives. I think the president's duty is to protect American lives. Now, finally, on the Cuban community, just let me tell you a short story, how the Cuban Americans feel about this. I heard my mother talking to her drunk kid one day, and the little girl, Bibi, was 6, and she said, well, what happened? What's Cuba? My mother said, Bibi, Cuba was like a house, and it got on fire. It was a big fire, and we have to run out. And the neighbors, the Americans, took us in. That's the way Cuban Americans look at the United States. If you go to the Vietnam Memorial, you could put your hand in the names of Cuban Americans there. So I leave you with that.
And thanks. And universal agreement would make a dull panel. So, no, and so that's much appreciated. Normally, I think we would try to have an exchange amongst us and basically respond to each other's comments. I think we've done a good job on equity and a good job on civility, but we're at the point where we have to go directly to the audience. And so I'm sure we'll get some exchanges from those questions as well, assuming your questions are brilliant. Right.
Well, before we do, can we please have a round of applause for our panel? And we'll now go out to your questions. Same rules of civility apply. Please do keep your question to a question. Raise your hand if you do have a question, and wait for me to recognize you. Yes, sir. The gentleman just over here.
And we need the
just wait
mic.
for the mic.
We need the mic.
To Marcelino Miyares.
Yes.
What do you think is going to be one of the dangers? I think is going to be the drug cartels when Cuba is more open. You know, Mexico is the closest neighbor to the United States with Canada. But look what happened to Mexico. Look what is happening in Puerto Rico. Look what is happening in Santo Domingo. So how come such a poor people like the Cuban people, how can they resist eventually all of the $1 billion that the drug cartel can put in Cuba?
Thank you.
Yeah. 2 things. Number 1, the fact that it is an island helps to stop, provided that the Cuban government contributes to stop the drug traffic from Cuba to the United States. The second fact, the information I have, is that at this present moment, in the past maybe, at the present moment, Cuban intelligence forces are working with the U.S. intelligence forces precisely to stop, and the expose that it was done for the Venezuelans who were in the drug cartel, and the Venezuelans that the U.S. government forbid to come to the United States were found because of the help of the Cuban intelligence with the American intelligence. So I don't believe that Cuba is going to risk everything they can gain, get it involved in drug trafficking, because the picture is larger for them. The Cuban picture, from the point of view of the Cuban government, is to normalize the situation, establish commerce with the United States, to raise to make the United States to raise the embargo, which can be done only by law from the U.S. Congress. But the larger picture from Cuba, they won't be politically correct ni practical if they allow Cuba to become a place for the drug cartel. That's my answer.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, the woman right here in the second row with the red jacket, please. The mic is just to your right.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm pretty loud, I guess. I have a question for Frank. Okay, Frank, I think we all agree that there was an embargo that was imposed, and the idea of it was to bring change to Cuba and to bring Cuba into compliance so that they wouldn't wreak all the havoc in the world that you described, correct?
No?
No, well, that was part of it, and they wanted Russia out of there. Now, Russia has been out of Cuba for 20-some years, so, and the embargo was still there. Let me ask you this question. If you went on a diet in order to try to lose weight and to try to get a result, and 25 years go by and you're still fat, what earthly use would this diet have been? And I'm equating the diet with the embargo.
We got that.
Thank you.
Anybody has any ideas for dieting, see me at the end. Let me try to go very quickly on that. The issue has never been whether to lift the embargo or not to lift the embargo. That is something that somebody throws out there all the time. Policy analysts will tell you that the issue has always been under what conditions, for what purpose, what is the goal. Now, you said the embargo didn't do anything. I'll tell you what the embargo did, because a lot of people think that. I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Well, if you would let me, I will tell you. Yeah. Here I'm happy I can talk without looking in the back, because in Havana I wouldn't be here by now. Here's what first of all, let's remember that some of the things that you have heard are not quite accurate. It is not true that the United States has not had diplomatic relations with Cuba for 50 years. That's simply false. Under President Jimmy Carter, intersections were open in Cuba and the United States. They have been, for all these years since then, more American diplomats in Cuba than they have been French, Spanish, Russian, or any others. It's not for lack of diplomatic contacts that we are where we are. Everybody keeps saying, I don't hear anybody say, well, why we have this problem? What was Cuba doing all this time? Now, you say the embargo didn't do anything. Let me tell you what it did. One, during the Cold War, it made Cuba very expensive for the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, that contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Two, it sent a message throughout the world, particularly Latin America, that if a government comes in, grabs all American properties, pays nothing, that the U.S. would do something about it. Three, it saved millions of dollars to all of you and other Americans. Why is that? The Canadians, the French, the others have been trading with Cuba and providing credit to Cuba and providing export insurance to Cuba, thought that by selling to Cuba you would get paid. You have a surprise. Many of those are the Paris Club. It's a long list of creditors, because after many years, for example, the Cuban government says to Argentina, why don't you just forgive my debt? And the Argentinians did. But I don't know how it happened in Argentina, but in this country, if you trade with another country, and remember, you're not trading with Cubans, you're trading with the Cuba government. You're trading with the Raul Castro family. When you're talking about entrepreneurs, you know what entrepreneurs are in Cuba? 450,000. That's what somebody says. Look it up. Look up the Cuban law. Now the Cuban can manufacture paper, flowers at home. You think that's going to help the Cuban economy? A Cuban now, until after 1968, Cubans could not independently cut hair, like be a barber.
And
Now they could do
Frank, you
that.
got about 30 seconds. I want to make sure some other people have a chance to
Yeah.
respond
Thank
as well.
you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Ted, Julissa, Alberto, would you like a chance to chime in on this, or should we go to the next question?
Go to the next one.
Okay, next question, please. Let's see. Yes, sir. The gentleman right there. Thank you.
Want to welcome Julissa, who's done such a tremendous job here to Chicago, and to Ted for all your information that you've given us. But Julissa, from your perspective, that you were in the early Obama administration playing a very key role in Latin America and overseeing that policy, take us at least 5 to 7 years from now. If we do normalize or improve relations, what does that do for our relationships as Americans, as America, with the rest of Latin America? In terms of all of those problems that the president would have whenever, I think, Al, you mentioned one time, that whenever the president met with anyone from Latin America, and you correctly said, they would ask, what's the matter with Cuba? You know, so take us now, how important is this to Mr. and Mrs. Smith from Beloit, Wisconsin, who doesn't even know that there's an embargo? What kind of improvement do we find in our relations with Latin America, given all the leftist movements and so on? Because that's what's really important to your common American.
Thank you.
How important is that?
Oh, good point. In terms of going forward, again, the normalization process with Cuba is going to take time. I'm imagining several years, right? From the diplomatic angle, the political angle, obviously the human rights conversations, negotiations, the economic embargo that is very much in place, and the multilateral dimension as well with respect to the possibility of Cuba receiving credit, which is a big piece of their ask. And then on top of that, you also have the very numerous lawsuits against the Cuban governments by Cuban citizens. That is also something that will have to be negotiated or dealt with going forward in terms of Cuba having a normal status as a borrower in the multinational financial space. It's a very, very complex long-term process. I think the big challenge in terms of the gesture, if you will, the macro gesture has already taken place, which is the President Obama's making an important symbolic gesture to Cuba, and by extension to all of Latin America and the Caribbean. How is that going to change, I think, going forward, assuming we manage the expectations? How is that going to be manifest itself with respect to the region and the Caribbean, Latin America in particular? I think people are going to have a better perception of the United States, a more positive idea of Americans, right? We have, in certain countries, the United States and American citizens in particular have very, very negative numbers with respect to how foreigners, Latin Americans in particular, especially the more south you go to Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, the numbers are extremely negative in how these citizens see the United States. They see us as imperialistas. They still have a very aged perception of how we do foreign policy. They still see Cuba as a victim of the United States imposition in terms of its colonial past. I think this dynamic is going to change that. And what does that mean? I think long term it will facilitate our ability to get things done, from having better political relations, from getting better, positive votes in the United Nations, to also working with these governments to do important things together in the region. That's politically. Economically, it's going to manifest itself in better commercial contact and trade. I think these things all percolate to different sectors of the relationship. And then thirdly, which is also very important, is cooperation around security, which I think has increasingly become kind of one of the main issues of interest between Latin America and the Caribbean and the United States. From Mexico all the way down to Argentina and Chile, you see that very, very deep interest in having a better cooperation with the United States around issues concerning trafficking and international crime, et cetera. So having trust in the United States, believing the United States is acting in good faith, that is listening to them, because every time they kept saying to us, resolve this problem with Cuba, I think finally we say, okay, we listened to you after decades, now listen to us and work with us on these issues. I think that's gonna be part of that dynamic. We're gonna maybe see some of it in Panama in the next 2 weeks' time, but it's really gonna happen more, it's gonna happen slowly over time as we move forward, because it was the two issues that were, the common denominator in many of these conversations were Cuba and security. We took care of Cuba, or more or less, at least in terms of the gesture. Now it's gonna have to focus very much so on the issues concerning crime and international cooperation around that issue. Thank you.
Well, we are out of time, but I do want to, Alberto or Ted or Marcelino, would you like a 30 seconds to help take us out? And
I'll give it to
We can do another 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, I'll be very, very brief, because I think Frank raised a lot of important points. And this question about your facts or not facts, I think facts are selectively chosen to make an argument. And I think that's what you're hearing. And I feel like there's a lot of echo of a Cold War mentality that doesn't recognize that we're in a different era. And Julissa, I think, explains the different era with the region. But also, Cuba is changing. It's slow, but Raul Castro is not Fidel Castro. And Raul is preparing a transition for when he leaves the scene, that we can start seeing a different Cuba that will be more of a hybrid economy, that will be more open to the world, and hopefully more open to its own people. And there are beginning to be seeds of that. We can see, if we pay attention to even debates that are happening online in the newspapers between Cuban citizens and the state. If you listen to what Raul Castro says, that we don't want Cuban people to be subjects of the state. We want them to be citizens. We want them to have their own role in society. This is not our version of democracy and capitalism, and it's not maybe ever going to be. But we have to, I think, recognize that there's a process of change. I think Marcelino said it so correctly. This is now the opportunity to shift away from the obsession on the embargo toward Cubans solving the problems for themselves. And the U.S. has to kind of get out of the way and help Cubans figure that out for themselves. And I think that's the moment we're in now, and that's a very positive moment that we can take advantage of.
I'm sorry, but I was mentioned, I like to respond real quick.
like
Since
15
you
seconds,
mentioned my
yeah,
name.
because I want to make sure the rest of the panel
He's
gets
had
it.
a lot.
Please,
Okay. 15 seconds, Frank.
Yeah.
It's not only the United States has to do something, Cuba has to do something.
I agree.
But that's never mentioned in the discussion, my friend.
Well, if we had a lot more time, there'd be a lot more to say.
Let me say that while you were talking about how things are changing in Cuba, yesterday, the ladies in white, mothers, wives of political prisoners, were again beaten and dragged down the street. And you're talking about the Cold War, you better tell that to Raul Castro and to the Russians who want to open up a spy station in Cuba, and in your presentation, you never mentioned that.
We started with Alberto. Why don't we finish with Alberto?
Alberto and Luis,
Thank you.
final thought as well.
I want to go back to a very important issue that Julissa brought up, which is that as we look forward, okay, there are lots of issues on the table that require that we work actively with Cuba as we work with other governments around the world with which we do not agree on many things, okay? And she was talking about how we want to make sure that 10, 15 years down the road, Cuba does not look like the Dominican Republic.
I love the Dominican Republic.
And I love the Dominican Republic too. Yeah. And exactly. And that Cuba, for that matter, doesn't look like Jamaica or doesn't look like Mexico. Okay? So that means we have to start focusing on issues like drug trafficking, transnational crime. We have to focus on issues involving environmental protection. We have to focus on issues involving common areas where we can do economic investment projects, where American companies can bring expertise to bear to address various problems. I also want to say, Cuba is changing. Generations do change. And the United States, I think, needs to position itself for that change. And again, it doesn't mean we approve of everything the Cuban government does, but that we are there working, using our influence, and particularly using the tremendous influence of those millions of Americans who over time, and American foundations, American private money, which over time will have gradually an impact on the evolution of Cuban society if our policy only allows that to happen. These are terrifically important factors over the next 15 years.
Okay, and Luis, I just want to give you the opportunity, 30 seconds, any final thoughts?
Yes, I'll be very brief. I don't have any political affiliation. I don't belong to any organization. I have academic freedom. That's very important to me. I say what I think is the truth. And I've been very honest with this audience as I am elsewhere. 3 points. 500,000 entrepreneurs in Cuba. These are people that were laid off by the Cuban government that was bankrupt. And they were told, now you're on your own. And we're not talking about people opening large restaurants or anything like that. We're talking about people who are called entrepreneurs, who have a little table out in the street, and they're refilling the types of lighters that we throw away. That's an entrepreneur according to the Cuban government. The other thing, I am so surprised that we have finally in this country bought the idea of trickle-down economics. It didn't work here. Is it going to work in Cuba? And then lastly, there's something very sinister about this. And again, I'm not against it. I'm for negotiations. But the success of large U.S. capital in Cuba depends on the continuation of a regime that is authoritarian, that pays Cubans 5% of what the Cuban government gets for the right to employ them.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, so please thank our panel.